Hello BookTube, my name is Elizabeth. Welcome or welcome back to my channel, Book as in Books. In this video, we are traveling to faraway places in three short books that are all very good reads. Now, I said faraway places. Shouldn't that depend on where you are? Yeah, it does depend on where you are. But if any of you, my dear viewers, is within 500 kilometers of these places, I'd be very curious to know. So what are these places? They are Canada. Okay, I'm in Canada. The Arctic North, so well north of the tree line. So if you're within 500 kilometers of the tree line, by the way, if you don't know what the tree line is, at some point, so Canada is covered in forest, except that at some point it just gets too cold and the trees don't grow. So that's the tree line. At some point you start to see the trees are shrinking, and not very long, there are no trees at all. And I say you because it's not me. I've never seen that. So I think I've seen pictures from the air. You can actually see, the forest almost ending, almost in a straight line. Anyway, so very far away in the north. So if any of you lives within 500 kilometers of Rankin Inlet, let's say, or Arviat, which was at the time the book was written, well, not at the time the book was written, at the time the author went there, it was called Eskimo Point. I'd be very curious to know about that. The other destination on our travels today is Bolivia. This one is, crossed off the map, Travels in Bolivia by Shafik Meikshi. And then our third destination, well, I don't know in what order I'm going to talk about the books, is Nepal. So this is Among the Flowers, A Walk in the Himalayas by Jamaica Kincaid. I might as well start with this one because I have it in my hands at the moment. So this book I read for People April. People April is a readathon where you are invited. I say you because this time I'm doing the invitation because I'm one of the hosts, where I invited you and everyone to read at least one book, or to read books that are nonfiction focused on people. So biographies, autobiographies, and memoirs. And that includes travel memoirs. And this is a travel memoir. So this is part of the literary travel series. And when I read the introduction, the first page, I was a bit envious of the author. The author was invited by the publishers of this book. I think it's National Geographic's, who are publishing not just this book, but the entire series. They invite authors to go to a country to do something that they love to do. Yeah, and there are people paid to do that. There are people paid to travel to do something that they love. It's hard not to be envious of these working conditions. So Jamaica Kincaid is a keen gardener, and she decided to go on a trek, not on her own, with a friend and with a group, to collect seeds for her garden, so flower seeds for her garden. And the Himalayas was a good choice because the friends that she went with, so she has a garden in Vermont, and that friend has a garden on the west coast. I don't remember exactly in which state, but one of the very rainy states on the west coast. So that means that the flowers that can grow in their respective gardens are not the same. So the advantage of the Himalayas was that because of the mountains, you have different climates. So depending on the altitude where you were, both could find flowers that would grow well in their respective gardens. So she takes us on a trip with her. It is an interesting book. However, in a way, we don't see much of Nepal because the group is going on a trek a bit in the middle of nowhere, and it's about the flowers that they were looking for. It's not so much about the people living in Nepal or the situation in Nepal. However, we do get a little bit of a something because the region they choose where to go on a trek was at the time disputed, was at the time there were communist rebels trying to get control of the region at the time. So it was not always easy, and I think it was a little bit dumb of the traveling party to go there despite the rebels and the rebellion and the somewhat shaky situation. The excuse that was given to Jamaica Kincaid before she left and once she was there was that, oh, the rebellion, it will not have any effect on you. Tourists are too important for the country. They will not touch you. But Anyway, if it was me, I wouldn't go. But anyway, this doesn't play a big part in the story. A little bit towards the end, they get in some villages, and sometimes they don't exactly know who's in control of the village or not, and on which side the population is, with the government against the government, with the rebel against the rebels. And there's a bit of an iffy situation once in a while. That the once or twice there was a little almost danger. Well, there was danger, but it's not really present in the book. So the book is really more about the trek and about finding the flowers. So it's fun. It was my first time reading Jamaica Kincaid, and I very much enjoyed her writing. And I'm probably going to try to find other books of that literary travel series, just to be envious of these authors paid to travel to do something that they love. That's the life. And then second book is Crossed Off the Map, Travels in Bolivia by Shafik Meghji. So this one is more of a traditional travel book. So the author contributed to the rough guide to Bolivia, so he had been there before, and he somewhat fell in love with the country, and he decided to write an entire book about it. So this is not a guidebook, so this is not about you should see that, and then there's a hotel here, and then there's a good restaurant there. And it's not about the author's experience specifically either, though it is written in the first person. This is what I saw, then I went to that place. So there's a bit of a memoir aspect to it, but it's not the point. The point really is to present Bolivia. So he presents the various places that he sees, so whether it's a national park or whether it's an old city, a ruin of I wanted to say pre-Inca, but even older than that, like dating from millennia ago, whether it's a mine, whether it's a city like La Paz, just presenting the various places in Bolivia, presenting the history of these places, presenting a bit the economic situation of the place, the social challenges that there are, just really a good presentation of the country. I really enjoy that. However, the book has a big flaw, a big flaw, or a small problem that is a big flaw. One good ingredient, or rather one ingredient that makes a good travel book is a good map. And there is a map in this book, but it's not even in black and white. It's in pale gray and white. And it's small, it's just half a page, and they're wasting space, and there's no explanation, like why is this region darker than that one? And then I say darker, it's a bit darker shade of pale gray rather than this very pale shade of pale gray. The map was not a success. So I use my iPad and my Google. So I use Google Maps instead, which was way more reliable than this printed map. So, but other than the map, I really enjoyed the book. It was really fun to read. And it was an introduction to Bolivia because I had never read anything about Bolivia. And the way I found the book was that it was on a list of best travel books of 2023 that I found on the website 5 Books. So that's how I knew the book existed, and I decided to read it. And it was good. I went to Bolivia. Woohoo! Well, I went to Bolivia in book. I've never been to Bolivia in real life. Let's be clear. I've never been to Bolivia in real life. Though I've been to Peru. Oh yeah, and there's a good quip in the book. The author mentions a sentence that was said by Percy Fawcett, the explorer who got lost in the Amazon jungle looking for the lost city of Zed. And he was a cartographer, and he had been to Bolivia and Peru and to Lake Titicaca, and he said about that lake very high in the mountains, it's the only place in the world where you can suffer at the same time from seasickness and altitude sickness. Which is very true. I didn't get any altitude sickness or seasickness when I was at Lake Titicaca on the Peruvian side, but I can easily imagine somebody suffering from both at the same time. So that brings us to our last book, which is not quite a travel book. Even though I found it in the travel section of the bookstore, it is not a travel book. It says, I would consider it now a history book. It is Walking on the Land by Farley Mowat. And this is about the Canadian North, the Arctic, beyond the tree line. So this is the map. So I don't know if you can see, but at the bottom, the very bottom, we can see the 4 western provinces. So that would be here British Columbia, Alberta, Manitoba, and no, Saskatchewan and Manitoba. And the territory in question is the district of Keewatin, which is today basically Nunavut, well, a part of Nunavut. And the tree line is this line. So underneath, it's forest, above it is tundra. And this book is not entirely new writing. It was published in 2000, and in it, the author actually revisits 2 books that he had published decades earlier. The first one was was People of the Deer, which was published in 1947, and this one is about it's about the Ihalmut people. So Ihalmut, Ihalmut. It's a people of Inuit culture, but they are not living near the coast. They are living inland, and they are living of hunting caribous. So they use the caribous for the meat, they use the skin for clothing and for shelter because it becomes tents. They use every part of the animal to do something. There's no waste at all. And in the winter, they have, well, in the summer too, they have dogs and they have sleds, but they don't use the sleds in the summer. They use it in the winter, and they can travel great distances with the dog sleds. And they lived a traditional lifestyle well up until the second half of the 20th century. So in 1947, I think that's the date when Farley Mowat was spent, I think it's a summer with the Ihalmut people, when he was basically, he crossed Canada in, well, I'm tempted to say on foot, so on foot and in canoe, from west to east in the north. And that's where he met the Ihalmut people. And in that book, he was somewhat critical of the institutions that were the somewhat encroaching on the territory of the Inuits. So the RCMP, so the mounted police, who was in charge of policing the territory, missionaries of all sorts of religion, all Christians generally, but they could be Catholics, they could be Anglicans, they could be evangelical, they could be pretty much anything. And the old Hudson Bay Company, which was basically the pioneers there. So Farley Mowat was somewhat critical of all 3, so he wasn't liked very much. And then 10 years later, he went back, because 10 years later, things had happened. In 1957-58, it had been, when he went back there, the people of the North were suffering from a famine. Basically, the caribou had disappeared. The migrations that had been predictable for generations and generations and generations simply disappeared. The caribou disappeared. And they had nothing to live on, because these lands are called the barren lands, because there's nothing that grows there, or almost nothing. And there's not many animals that can survive there. And many people died. They died, and the responsibility is not... We cannot say that it was an intentional famine, the same way that there was in Ukraine in the 1930s, created by the Soviet Union deliberately to bring the people to heal. That's not exactly what happened. But when the famine happened, the various institutions, in many cases, did nothing officially. It was down to individuals who tried their best to help the people. Some other individuals decided that it was not their problem, it's someone else's problem. So in 1958, so 10 years later, Farley Mowat published, I say 1958, I don't remember the exact date, so I'll just write it in below if it's not the exact date. He published another book called The Desperate People, to bring the attention to the plight that these people were living. And this book, Walking on the Land, was published 40 years later in 2000, because in 1999, the daughter of one of the women who was, I'm going to say, featured in The Desperate People. Her name was Kikik. And the reason she became famous was that she was accused of murder. A man had killed her husband, and then she killed that man. And she was brought to justice, and the judge ordered the jury to acquit her. because she had undergone so much. He just ordered an acquittal, so it was a directed verdict. And Farley Mowat decided in the 1950s to go back to tell the story of that woman and to see what had changed in the last 10 years that such a situation happened. But 40 years later, the daughter of that woman asked him to write about it again, to say, don't let our story be forgotten. Please write about it again. It's important to bring more facts to light because there are still things that have not been told. So this book, it largely takes the first two books that Mowat had published in 1940s and 50s, but he also includes new information that at the time he had not published because I suppose his editor agreed that they were not publishable. Some things were too horrible, or perhaps it was too risky of lawsuits, perhaps, but you can shock your public only up to a point, because at some point they just stop listening, they look away, and there's no point in writing the book. So he didn't want to write too horrible things because he would lose his public. So he had to hold things back, and then 40 years later in 2000, he didn't have that same obligation, so he wrote everything that time. So that's why I hesitate to call this a travel book, because yes, Farley Mowat travels very far north. He goes to several places to try to get the fact of what happened. Why did that famine happen? And how come the people that he had met in the middle, really in the middle of of Keewatin, like about here, what were they doing here and here? It's just, why had they been displaced? And these were decisions by the government, who decided, well, if they cannot take care of themselves, we'll take care of them. And they moved them to places where the caribou had never been, that were difficult of access, it's one tragedy after another. And it's such a sad book. But at the same time, I'm thinking this should be mandatory reading in Canada. It explains just so much. Sometimes I think that as a citizen, I'm not completely ignorant of things that happen in my country. I think that I'm interested in many things that happen in my country, in the past, in the present. I pay attention to the news, I pay attention to politics, I pay attention to various cultural happenings. And yet there are great big holes in my knowledge, and the North and anything that happened in the North was part of that big hole, and now it has been filled a little bit. I have a little nugget of knowledge about what happened in the North, but it's still, it's not enough. I'm going to have to read more about it. I'm going to have to learn more about the situation. But I think this is a good starting point. It gave me a bit of an idea of who the Iqaluit people were and other people around them. That's different. I was not even aware that Inuits were not. Gosh, I hesitate to say that. It's easy to consider sometimes a people as being homogeneous. I was interrupted by a phone call. I was saying that it had not crossed my mind that Inuit was not a single people, that it was a multiplicity of people that had different ways of living, that covered a territory so vast. How can I be surprised by that? The territory is the size of Europe. How can I be surprised that the people living in the territory the size of Europe have different cultures? How could I be surprised by that? And yet I was. I feel stupid. But I'm less stupid now, which is the point of reading books, and it's the point of being open to the world. So I was saying this should be mandatory reading for everyone in Canada, but in particular, any politician. It should be read. The story of the Iqaluit, and I believe that story probably has echoes with many other people of the North and many other Indigenous people in Canada. At the very end of the book, when Farley Mowat left in 1958, he had to leave. He had to take the plane because he could not spend the entire winter there. So he left. And when he left, he left, the place was called at the time Eskimo Point. It is now called Arviat. When he left Eskimo Point, there was an epidemic of hepatitis among the Inuit people, not just Ihalmuts, but other Inuit people who were living everywhere in the territory. There was a plane that arrived, so they had asked for immediate supplies to help stop the epidemic, because it's contagious, and yeah, they didn't want another catastrophe that the people living there, well, the person responsible for Northern Affairs and even the RCMP constable, they didn't want another series of deaths. So they had asked Ottawa to send in all emergency medications. So a first plane arrived, and that was not medication. That was the plane to take I think it was the RCMP officer back to the south for his annual vacation. And then they were very frustrated. They wanted to put sick people on the plane, but the person flying the plane said, no, I'm not allowed to do anything that is not authorized by Ottawa. I cannot do that. We're just leaving. And they just left. And then a second plane arrived, and they thought, okay, that's the plane. No, that plane did not bring medication at all. It was once again judicial officials, so the court from Yellowknife, that was coming to put some people on trial, and they did not bring medication. And not long after that, after the first plane had left, there was a man, the responsible for Northern Affairs, just came rushing into the cabin where there was the radio, and he said, bring the plane back, bring the police officer back, they need to come back, it's for a criminal affair, they must come back. And the plane did not come back, and the criminal affair was that they had just found out, there had been rumors, but they had official confirmation, like with testimonies, that the nurse, the one and only medical officer in the village, had raped patients, including children. And he was the only person with the medical knowledge to take care of the people who were sick. So they could not really arrest him because the patients would die. But if they let him loose, he would do horrible stuff. And the police plane did not come back for him. And that's when Farley Mowat left. So we don't know whatever followed. And we are left with the impression that the affair was quashed, that it was hushed, that probably the nurse was just removed and replaced by someone else, and that nothing else happened. And yes, also just before Farley Mowat left, there were a few Ihalmut people still living in Eskimo Point, and they were to be taken to a new settlement, which was at what's the name of the place? At Turn Point. So even more north. So where's the map? So this is Eskimo Point, and they were to be taken even more north. So they were coming from somewhere like around here, and they were being taken all the way there. And that's a place where no caribou had ever been. And the person responsible for that new settlement had great projects. Oh, we will have factories. There is a great sewage system that we'll buy from Korea. We will export food from the north, so canned caribou food and canned, I don't know what. He had a great vision of an industrial north. And it's just that anyone who had ever been to that place, how did I call it again? Turner Point? Is that Turn Point? To Turn Point had told everyone in Ottawa that it was a terrible choice, because the port was so shallow that no boat could come there. So if you want to export stuff, the boat could not come in. To build your ideal city, you need materials to come in from the south. The boat could not come. And also, you wanted to can caribou. There's no caribou going there. There was no caribou anywhere at that point, but there had never been caribou at that place. So what were you supposed to do? So it was just a terrible idea. The people kept suffering, and many, at least it was not a prison, I guess, but those who were strong enough managed to leave and come back to Eskimo Point, which is today Arviat, and try to make a living as they could. And I forgot to say that in all of their displacements like this, the Ihalmut were taken without any consultation, obviously, and they were just taken from their homes and put onto planes, and they were not allowed to bring anything, just stuff that they carried with them. And that was in the 1950s. So many of the people involved, the white people involved, they were all men. So many of these men had actually fought in World War II. And many of them could see that it was the exact same thing that had been done to the Jews during World War II. Just take them from a place, they cannot carry anything with them, and put them in a strange place where they have to obey rules that they don't recognize. The dogs were not allowed to roam free. The dogs had to be put on leashes and tethered all the time. Well, these dogs were miserable. And if the dogs were left to wander on their own, the RCMP officer would just shoot them. And the dogs would be killed. One of the reasons the dogs were killed was to prevent the Inuit or other Inuit people to go back to the place where they knew. They had to stay in their new places, whether they like it or not. So there were no fences, but in a way they were stuck, like in a concentration camp. And it's just so sad. So anyway, I think that's the most moving book that I've read this year. And as I said, should be mandatory reading for anyone that has any role in public life in Canada, and probably for all Canadians. I think, I don't always say that, I rarely say that, but I think reading a book like this can make somebody a better person, at least a less stupid person. So which is already, it's a good beginning if you're a bit less ignorant after reading a book. So that's an excellent book, and absolutely, completely, totally recommend kind of a book. And I'm going to try to read more Farley Mowat and more books about the Canadian North, because it's a place that I don't know, even though I live in the same country, it's a faraway place from me. And that's it. On that rather sad note, but it's a happy note, because I'm telling you this is a good book, so this is a happy note. I'm going to say thank you everyone for watching, and if you've ever been to one of these 3 places, I'd be curious to know. So I will see you in the next video. À la prochaine.